Welcome to GOS Media. I'm Samantha Van Valkenburg. A big city detective inherited his family's rural homestead and was soon hired by the county's sheriff. Excited to bring sophisticated crime solving to an unsophisticated people, the detective was zealous in his crime scene investigations. His first case was a breaking and entering that occurred in one of the farmhouses. The sheriff wanted him to take fingerprints. However, the detective convinced him that there was a better way. Apparently, the perpetrator had nicked his finger and left blood droplets around the broken window. He went on to explain that it would be better to use a DNA kit which would leave no doubt as to who the culprit was. The sheriff agreed to let the man use his big city technique. Normally, it would take a couple of months to get the results back, but the detective still had friends at the state crime lab and was able to get the results back in just a week or two. The report indicated that the perpetrator's DNA was consistent with a female assailant, yet there were no matches in the database. The sheriff was doubtful about the results. However, DNA does not lie, the detective assured him. The next case he worked was a stolen car. Well, actually, it was a stolen truck. Of course it was a stolen truck, the detective chuckled to himself. All these country bumpkins drive as trucks. The sheriff asked the detective if it seemed odd that the truck was only driven from the barn to the end of the driveway where it was stuck in a ditch. The detective wasn't interested in any other clues. He was busy swiping the steering wheel with cotton swabs from the DNA kit. Everyone was surprised when the DNA again came back as a female assailant, yet there were no matches in the database. The sheriff's doubt was now turning into suspicion that there was something wrong with the kits. The detective reported he had personally checked the expiration date, and the kits were still valid. He also reminded the sheriff that the state lab was the best there was for processing DNA, and since DNA doesn't lie, the sheriff needed to accept the fact that there was a female criminal loose in the county. A few nights later, someone broke into the general store and stole some odds and ends to include a couple bottles of whiskey. Searching the area for clues, they came across an empty whiskey bottle down at the swimming hole. The detective swabbed the mouth of the bottle for saliva, and once again, the results indicated a female perpetrator, and no matches found in the database. The detective lived by the notion that 1 is an uh-oh, 2 is a coincidence, and 3 is a pattern. However, on this third occasion, the sheriff was now convinced that there was something wrong with the kits. Yet the detective remained adamant that DNA does not lie, and again convinced the sheriff to trust the science. More so, he wanted to use a strategy that was common in big cities. He needed the sheriff to ask all of the females to voluntarily take a DNA test. If any female or group of females decline, she or they would become the prime suspects. Against his better judgment, the sheriff did as the detective requested. The detective was surprised when all females complied with the sheriff's request. The sheriff explained to the detective that the ladies of the county also wanted the crime spree to come to an end. It was a couple of days later that the father of a 13-year-old boy reported his son's bike as missing. One of the deputies found it behind the movie theater, and it was also discovered that the back door of the theater had been jimmied open. And, of course, the handlebars and the doorknob was swabbed by the detective and sent to the state lab. The sheriff and his deputies were now convinced that the culprit to all of these petty crimes was not an unknown female. They were certain it was little Stevie, a 13-year-old boy who was known as the mischief of the county. But, to their surprise, the detective received news from the state crime lab that they had a female match for the stolen bicycle. Reluctantly, and with just a bit of embarrassment, the sheriff drove the deputy to Miss Ida May's house, a 64-year-old widower woman who wore braces on her legs. Nonetheless, the detective demanded that she be taken to the station for questioning. Turns out, and to no one's surprise except the detective, the old woman was innocent of all charges. Seems she worked at the company that assembles the DNA kits used in the county, and though she was supposed to wear gloves, they made her hands itch, so she never wore them, which, of course, contaminated every cotton swab with her own DNA. Today's story is based upon a true event, and the detective in this story was caught up in what is called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency for us to interpret evidence through the lens of our preconceived belief instead of allowing the evidence to speak for itself. Even though the evidence pointed to a contaminated kit and a mischievous young boy, the detective had convinced his own mind that it was a female perpetrator and refused to entertain any other possibilities. When it comes to investigating crimes, a good detective should do everything to prove that the primary suspect is innocent, not guilty. By doing such, it actually builds a stronger case and it mitigates confirmation bias. But as we know, there's not enough cops and too many criminals. So, far too often, investigators operate from the confirmation bias. Not just detectives, you and I are also prone to confirmation bias. Every time we encounter a new situation, we tend to default to our confirmation bias, especially if a situation is intense, unusual, or risky. It is an uncomfortable feeling when we sense circumstances are slipping out of our control, and our confirmation bias is like a security blanket, allowing us to believe we have at least some control over the situation. Even though confirmation bias may be our default interpretation, it can be overcome. This we do by challenging ourselves to reevaluate the situation and circumstances with a doubtful and critical eye. Not that we become doubtful of what we're experiencing, rather, we are forcing ourselves to do what detectives should do. We seek to disprove our first assumption. It is also very helpful to ask others in the situation if your interpretation is reasonable, or could there be alternative facts that ought to be considered? All in all, the best approach to keep from reaching our preconceived notions is to pause and recall today's grain of sugar. Be willing to be wrong. In most cases, there's nothing wrong about being wrong. Truth is, great wisdom can be gained when someone is willing to be found wrong. If there's a time in your life where you gained wisdom by having the courage to be wrong, tell us about it in the comments below. You will be encouraging the colony to do likewise. We can't say it enough, and we will say it now. Thank you so incredibly much for your support. It keeps us in the sugar business. If you would like to join the colony, please like, subscribe, and share with others. Then head on over to our website and snag up some merch. Or maybe you want to buy us all a cup of coffee. Links are pinned below, and for those of you who are really adventurous, join us on Patreon for special perks and programs. Once again, thanks for tuning into Grains of Sugar. I've been your host, Samantha Van Valkenburg.